two special guests on the podcast, and joining me today to help bolster the theology is John Enarson. And John, what do you have to say about yourself? Explain to the audience who you are and why you're part of this conversation.
Yeah, so my name is John Enarson, and I work together with you in the organization Cry for Zion. I'm the Christian Relations Director. So I'm a Swedish Christian. I study theology, working on a Bachelor of Theology long distance from Sweden, but I've been living in Israel for a good many years. And I'm a member of the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology. And we were kind of talking the other day about a lot of the pressing concerns that we have today with questions about Israel. And I was like, have you seen this new resource, this new book from Christopher Kuehl, and Doron's like, oh, I think I've met that guy. And we were talking, I was like, you got to get him on your show. And I said, well, if you're going to get him, I really want to be there. So I think he has a resource that is so pressing and urgent and so needed, aimed at the right target audience. So that's why I'm here joining you on the conversation.
Awesome. Well, Christopher, you're the man of the hour. Your book is incredible, by the way. I have a lot of books on theology, Israel, Zionism, Christian Zionism, Jewish Zionism, you name it. I think I've read most of the big books and listened to some of the big people in that. But your book, in my opinion, for Christian audiences is just, it's dynamite. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you to write this incredible book.
Yeah. Well, first, thank you. I'm super honored both by you guys' feedback. And John, it's great that you're here as well. And Doron, I'm really just honored that you invited me on. So I feel like in some ways I've been writing this book for 20 years in my heart, if that makes sense. I guess professionally about a year and a half ago started my master's journey on theology. And I decided to make the decision as a 40-year-old basically to go back and get my master's degree in theology, which is kind of funny because I didn't really enjoy school the first time around. I was an accounting finance major, and my plan was to go work on Wall Street at Goldman or one of these big firms, and that was going to be my life, was doing the financial thing up in New York. And so, but right before this happened, I had gotten pretty radically saved, and I just by kind of happenstance, just accidentally really is kind of how I describe this experience, ended up working for a year and a half in Israel at an organization called Bridges for Peace. And I was completely fascinated by this experience. And so since then, I've been back probably 15 times, back to the land. And I have not been able to shake my experience over there, 20 years later. And so, about, I guess, I don't know, for 3 or 4 years ago, I started watching this new form of, I don't want to call all of it anti-Semitism, but certainly an anti-Zionism, which I think we'll talk about later, how that connects to at least a form of anti-Semitism. And I saw this new attack coming on Israel and the Jewish people, and I was really kind of fascinated, but also disturbed by this. And so in many ways, I chose to go back and get my master's in theology because I wanted to wrestle through the conversation that's happening basically in full view of the internet right now. And, I had certain presuppositions and thoughts on that, but I couldn't articulate them as well as I wish that I could. And so I made the decision to go back and get a master's in theology to really examine some of the questions that, the book tries to answer.
Yeah. Well, you definitely did a great job at making this very accessible, I would say. Why did you make it in such a way, I guess, that basically you're not using like the high language that you'll see in theological seminaries or other works that are just very like over your head? What would you say motivated you to make it in an accessible, I guess you could say, like the working man's language, so to speak, like my kind of language, the stuff that I can relate to, and make it simple for me, right?
Right. Well, that's a great question. I think there's probably 2 or 3 reasons behind that. The first is that no one really reads theology. I think even within the church, the statistic on people inside the church that read theology is like 1 or 2%. It's like pitifully low. And I wanted to write a book that people would read. And beyond that, I think Einstein said something brilliant that I always try to keep in mind, which is that unless you can explain something to a child, you don't actually know what you're talking about. And so I think that in some ways, what is the most difficult thing to do is take complicated ideas and translate them in a way for someone who is working a 9 to 5 job and has 4 kids and doesn't have time to really like explore, is the church the new Israel? Is Zionism a brain virus? All these questions that are being thrown around on the internet, they don't have time to read, a 70-page academic paper and then read 40 others that respond to this paper. So I wanted to give someone a resource that hadn't gone through a ton of training, that was, trying to land this discussion where it is in the common man's language and the discourse that's happening right now. So that was really the goal behind it.
I like it. I like it. And I agree, because that's all the stuff that I've read. Most books, they're exactly that. I think the only one that I've seen that kind of doesn't go over your head is Michael Evans. He has a 2-book series on Christian Zionism, and to me, that's a really good work. But again, it's a 2-volume. It's still heavy, and what I've noticed is you were able to take a lot of like what he has and others have, and just make it into something, like you said, accessible.
Yeah.
And I agree. That's job accomplished, brother. It's bang on. It's still a heavy read for some people, I would say,
Sure.
right? Because I think in these days, like you pointed out, they're becoming really illiterate, right? It's like TikTok, scroll, short, quick, give it to me now, fast food information. But to be honest, and this is part of this conversation, you really want to understand these topics we're talking about, and people are really arrogantly and ignorantly discussing, like Tucker and others, who talk about these matters like they know what they're talking about. It's like, how many times have you read through the Bible? Once, I think Tucker claims to have. Candace Owens, I don't think I've ever heard her talk about. I think she's filled the airwaves with millions of hours by now, but I don't remember any clip of her talking about her deep theological understanding of Scripture because of reading Scripture. But
Sure.
typically, I'll hear them talking about theology and how theology counters Zionism, right? But still, like you took actual Scripture and you laid it out. You took actual theological arguments, laid it out. You gave all the gamma, actually, and you yourself call yourself a spiritual Zionist. Can you explain that to the folks here, and so they can understand a little bit of that dynamic and how you're looking at this subject from your angle?
Sure. Well, I would say that political Zionism is primarily, like Theodore Herzl, for instance, was a political Zionist, but he was not actually motivated by inherently, maybe he was because of his influence and his, how his proximity to so much Christian Zionism, which many of his friends were Christian Zionists. But his core belief, and if we just, for simplicity's sake, define Zionism as the belief of the Jewish people's right of return to their ancestral homeland, I would say spiritual Zionism is that same definition, but it finds its roots in the Bible as a justification for that belief. Okay. So that's how I would define spiritual Zionism. Now, I don't inherently think that means that America needs to take, I don't feel like I have to have an opinion on Bibi Netanyahu as a spiritual Zionist. Like, he might be the best thing for Israel. He might not be. I'm not, I leave that up to Israel's population to decide and to have a process around that. So I think one of the issues with the Zionism that I grew up around is that it basically rubber stamped everything that Israel did and said, hey, this is, no matter what, this is like God's behind all this. And so that means that we have to take this approach as an American nation, and we have to fund this. And I don't inherently believe that. I believe that ultimately that the Jewish diaspora over the last 1900 years was preserved and protected by God, even though part of it, I would say, is a judgment, which I would believe that, my conversations with rabbinic Judaism as well has led me to believe that that's their belief as well, and that it was the Lord who brought the Jewish people back to the land of Israel. And so I believe that it is ultimately the Lord that protects and sustains the Jewish people in that land. And so what I mean by spiritual Zionism is that how I view this is as a ultimate spiritual reality and a belief that isn't inherently married to every political decision that Israel makes. I also don't find justification for the Jewish right of return to the land as, as a political project on those grounds, even though I think you could make the case that, Israel is by far the best place to live in the Middle East, compared to any other country. So I try to distinguish it along those terms and on
Would
those
you
lines.
see, in that definition of a spiritual Zionism, would you see some crossover to political effects? Like, would you see that? Would you define that as seeing God's hand in history in bringing back now not quite 50% of the Jewish exile and dispersion around the world back to Israel, granting them an independent sovereignty in 1948? Obviously, through a lot of mess, a lot of suffering, wars and conflict. But does spiritual Zionism, in that definition, have some sort of effect on the political reality that God is somehow moving in history here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say even more than that, my belief is that the spiritual layer is kind of the substruct to all reality. So it's going to impact political. It's going to have spillover in these other categories. But for me, it's not the primary way that I justify what I believe is a biblical case for Zionism.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
But I also, here, there's an ongoing conversation right now, in America as to what what we should be funding when it comes to Israel. Now, on one hand, I recognize that most of the people that are projecting this conversation forward, really just hate Israel, and I don't think there is running cover for something different. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't think it's actually I don't think it makes a difference for Israel whether America chooses to fund Israel or not. I think that God will continue to preserve the Jewish people regardless of the decision America makes. So when I say spiritual Zionism, I also mean a Zionism that is preserved through any decision that the nations make. Like I believe that this project will continue regardless of what choice America makes in this question right now.
Great. Doron, you mind if I take this one? I was talking with you earlier. We really want to hit on this. We talk about dispensationalism, the Schofield Bible, these hot button topics. And Doron wrote down one of these quotes. He says, one of my favorite movie lines, one of the quotes from your book, chapter 7, you write, one of my favorite movie lines is Inigo Montoya's in The Princess Bride. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. So
Yeah.
if I were
You didn't
to
do it with the accent though, John. You didn't do it with the
no,
accent.
I'm not going to attempt it. I'm not going to butcher it online. But to get to the point, if we were to tee it up like this, I would say kind of a major swath of the attack on Christian Zionism, on seeing the Jewish people as continued being God's chosen people or elect somehow in God's redemptive plan still. The attack goes something like this, that Jewish Zionists had a conspiracy that infiltrated the church somewhere in the early 1900s with a heresy called dispensationalism, maybe through the Schofield Study Bible, to convert Christians into Zionist heretics. So it implies that maybe Jews are behind it or Zionists are behind it. And it's a heresy with no real Christian history to back it up. And everyone who supports the relationship with the nation of Israel or the Jewish nation must be a dispensationalist. So you did a really good job in your book, but could you walk us through what you do to dismantle this kind of straw man argument,
Sure.
which we see a lot today?
Yeah, and I would say that actually that's one of the main reasons why I wrote this book was because of that argument that you just put forward. And I think you did a great job of kind of highlighting the basic thrust of that argument. So there's the famous kind of conspiracy TikToker Ian Carroll, who did a whole thing. He did a whole series on trying to connect the dots that you just connected there. And then the actual theologian Wes Huff, who's not a Zionist, at least to my knowledge, did a whole response video responding to Ian Carroll, and he did such a great job of just dismantling this claim. So there's multiple claims within this argument. The first one we could just take on is the Scofield Bible. You're hearing a lot about the Scofield Bible. The more nefarious Scofield Bible accusation is that the Rothschilds funded this. But it was completely produced by the Oxford Press out of Oxford University in England. And so, Oxford University has been around since the 1600s. They're not owned by the Rothschilds. The first producers of the Scofield Bible was the Oxford Press. There's no Rothschild connection to it at all. And Ian Carroll tried to make the claim that Scofield had changed the text of the Bible, but he just used the King James version of the Bible in literally thousands of other commentaries that exist out there. He just provided his notes and commentary to the King James Bible. There was no nefarious. So you have this Bible that was produced by the Oxford Press that is just the normal King James Bible that has Scofield commentary, which takes a dispensational, systematic theological approach to evaluating scripture. But that's not abnormal. There's literally thousands of commentaries of people that have, just provided their commentary. So this idea that this is that the Scofield Bible is a nefarious Rothschild scheme basically falls apart upon contact with reality. But there's a deeper accusation against this, which is that Zionism is a very recent fad. Something that happened in the 1900s is basically yesterday in terms of the historical record. And so that's a deeper question. Is Christian Zionism a new fad that the church has not made room for or seen? And if so, what does that mean? I think it's kind of ultimately the question that I was trying to wrestle with in a real way through this book. And so there's multiple ways that you can evaluate this. For the short answer is that there was actually quite a few people in the early church, if we're talking about the pre-Nicene church fathers, which would basically take us through 325, but you could go a little bit further than that. It was Saint Jerome, Irenaeus, Ignatius, and Eusebius, who are major pillars in the early church. They all wrote about a future regathering of the Jewish people.
We could just to quotes. You put a great quote in the beginning of your chapters, and I think we should quote Tertullian here. So this is AD 160 through 240. So 2nd century, early church father. He's writing, quote, "For it will be fitting for the Christian to rejoice and not to grieve at the restoration of Israel, if it be true, as it is, that the whole of our hope is intimately united with the remaining expectation of Israel." So that puts it a little bit older than maybe modern dispensationalism.
Just a little bit there, right? And so you see that, and then you also see, as soon as the Protestant Reformation happens, in the 1500s, you see a major movement of. First, what happens is a literal reading of Scripture. That's one of the main things that the Protestant Reformation does, is that it's a move away to some degree from tradition with more of an emphasis on Scripture. And then as soon as that happens, shocking, Israel and the Jews come back into focus, right? Because you cannot untangle those two realities. So as soon as the Reformation happens and this emphasis, then you start seeing all these great reformers start talking about, hey, the Jews are going to be regathered one day. The Jews are going to, we're talking about, it goes all the way back to, I would say the first, you've got Increase Mather talking about it. You've got J.C. Riley, you've got Charles Hodges, you've got Jonathan Edward, who is arguably the greatest Reformed philosopher and theologian in America. His entire view centered around the Jewish people returning to the land of Israel. You've got Charles Spurgeon talking about it. You've got people that are close to George Washington with the founding of America who are saying, we believe America is going to be founded so that we can one day help like start the Jewish nation. So you have this thing that's happening as soon as the Protestant Reformation happens. And it's hard to deny that God's not at work in this. You certainly can't blame it on dispensationalism. So one of the main things that I'm arguing for in this book is that it's just ignorant slander, that this comes down to. And it also treats actual dispensationalism really unfairly in many ways, which I think has become kind of a slanderous term for a Christian who has a positive perspective on the Jewish people and the nation of Israel. That's basically why dispensationalism, in my view, is being hammered right now.
Would you say in our generation that, like, I'm a Christian, I'm not a dispensationalist, you're not a dispensationalist, we would give them credit where credit is due, but would you say today that Christian supporters of Israel are maybe like, do we have any guess as to how many are dispensationalists or not now? Is it half? Maybe the majority are not even dispensational anymore.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that many people are just your average non-denominational perspective who might not have a real fundamental eschatology of, the world. I think it's like I think that's a good percentage. I don't know, because the thing is what they accuse, what they being the online world accuses dispensationalism. I never meet anyone who believes those things. It's a total straw man to my experience. And I've read so much, progressive dispensationalism, and I never see the things that they're accused of in their writing either. Like, so I don't know. I just think this is why I really have come to believe that they're unfairly maligned, because they take an overt and positive perspective on the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And for that sin, they are basically, from a scholarship standpoint, crucified.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they're totally gaslighting us with like the most ridiculous, outlandish, non-existent argument, like you pointed out. I travel a lot in the United States. I get invited to churches all the time to
Mhm.
talk about Israel, because these are Christians like we're discussing who are either
Mhm.
Zionist or they just have a love for Israel. They have a minimum or shallow knowledge or understanding, which is why they want me to come and talk about Israel. It's not necessarily like these hardliner,
Mhm.
John Hagee types or whatever. In
Sure.
fact, I don't think I've ever even spoken at a church that is directly connected to Kufi, for example.
Mhm.
No, I'll take it back. I have one church I can think of where the guy that invited me, he's college campus. He does like college campus talks and whatever. Who's a former
Mhm.
Green Beret, and we're
Mhm.
connected because of our special forces
Mhm.
backgrounds and whatnot. But the church itself, it's not like a Kufi church. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
Um, and so
And you
that's
don't
the
have to be
majority of my personal
dispensational to be part of
experience.
Kufi either.
Right.
No,
Yeah,
no, but for
totally.
example, that I can think of, right? But again, my personal involvement and connection. I never heard anyone talk dispensationalist theology. A lot of the pastors want to check me out before I get to speak on their pulpit, because of course they're a little leery of having an
Mhm.
Israeli, and
Mhm.
he's not a Christian, from one of
Mhm.
our denominational guys. We're making an
Mhm.
exception to give them to give them the platform. And as they're questioning me, dispensationalism never gets brought up. I've never heard it, or in
Totally.
any of my theological studies, even for that
It
for that
it
matter.
yeah, it is. I really believe it's either, it's a straw man to this whole thing. It's being used to malign people that love the Jewish people, that care about the state of Israel. Um, and here's another thing that I think is worth bringing up as we talk about dispensationalism and kind of the witness of the church. There was a great Orthodox Christian theologian, maybe the only one that I've ever read in my entire life, who took an honest evaluation. I touch on this in my book, and I wish I had read this document before I wrote my book, but I read it afterwards, and I would have incorporated some of what he said. But he basically makes the case that the patristic and medieval scholarship and theology of the church that wrote about the replacement of the Jews predicated that belief. Basically, like the presumption that undergirded that was that the Jews would never return to the land of Israel. Okay. So that was kind of like, this is what they would write about. Now, in their day, I understand to some degree how they came to that position, but you have to be honest and say, okay, if that presupposition falls apart, which happened in 1948, if that presupposition falls apart, basically everything else that you've said up to this point is wrong. Like you have got to be honest with that reality. So even the Christians that chose to take a more replacement view on the Jewish people built that argument around the belief that the Jews would never be returned to the land of Israel. Now, they built that belief too on God's judgment. They talk about how it will be impossible for you to come back. So you cannot blame the Jewish return on dispensationalism, Rothschilds, UN, whatever excuse you see on the internet. That none of those factors are stronger than God, which is what the church fathers and the medieval people that were writing about this, that was their core belief. So what bothers me so much about the traditionalist argument right now is, when they quote Augustine, when they quote these guys who say this, is because they're not being fair to their own writings. Okay. It was their fundamental belief, their presupposition that they built everything on was the permanent removal of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. So if that was not true, which it's not, you have to throw the rest of the argument out. Like you cannot keep running with it. And so I think that what we have here is something that to me defies both theological and rational explanation for why people just cannot see this. And that's this moment that we're in right now.
How would you look at? I've been wanting to ask this. It's not on the list, and if you don't have an answer that you care to give, but do you have any insight on? I feel like we're living in a strange moment culturally after COVID, where it seems like truth is truly up for grabs. I read some quote about some point in Greek philosophy there came the radical skeptics because they believed like all these truth claims were used for nefarious purposes. Like you just couldn't even talk about facts and truth anymore.
Yeah.
I don't know what's happening culturally, but it
Yeah.
feels like we can almost not have a argument about truth anymore.
Well, I think your timing on this is exactly right. I would place it right at the COVID window as well. And to be fair to the skeptics, I think we all saw, many of us believed, it was there the whole time. But I think as a culture, we had a moment where we realized like, holy cow, like we are being lied to and shaped, and all these things are happening in this very specific way that we didn't understand, and I think that there was kind of a mass, um, I hate to use this term, but a mass awakening to some degree of reality. And as soon as that happened, people start looking for kind of a grand unifying theme for why is there evil and why is there all these things. And as soon as that happens, the ancient scapegoat appears, which is the Jewish people, and so you have this kind of the oldest hatred. Some call it the oldest hatred that's ever, that the world has ever experienced. So, but I think that what else is happening, the other thing that's happening, and there is a good in this, is that the church is like, wow, we have been totally demoored from our tradition. Like we have this very progressive thing that's happening in the church right now. We have all of this, whether you want to blame it on like just the mass mega pastor celebrity culture, like kind of falling in on itself right now. You kind of have everything has been uprooted and everyone's asking the questions like, we have to return to tradition. We have to return to foundations. We have to return, like maybe we'll find stability there. And so that's why you have this resurgence and people checking out the Catholic Church, checking out Orthodoxy, checking out these kind of ancient faith systems, because they're grappling, they're dealing with that exact moment that you're talking about, and their way of trying to solve that is to try to go back 2000 years. And then as soon as you do that and you don't know how to properly process what some of the statements about the Jews were, then that gets thrown into all this same mixture. And so I think in some ways, if you had to put my feet to the fire, that's how I would describe this cultural moment.
Doron, that sounds like a lot of what we've been talking about with you about people want to go back to like a good America, God faith America, go back to some sort of roots, but there's strange stuff afoot. You want to bring any of that up?
Yeah. I would say that, so talking about that, the Christian roots of America, America first, all these statements like that we're hearing now, Christ is king, as
Right.
these catchphrases. But the question really is, what was America founded on? Who were the founding fathers? You alluded to that a little bit here about those close to George Washington, and you talk about that also in your book. Can you kind of give people a good understanding of who are the founding fathers faith-wise, what motivated them to create this newfound new hope, new land in the Americas, and were the founding fathers basically anti-Israel, or were they actually were they other than that? I mean, what was their worldview, I guess, on
Yeah.
that?
And
Well,
secondly, when you've done so much study with this, I heard you say you almost maybe read hundreds, maybe even 1,000 books to do all these studies for this book. And being an American, like I'm kind of coming as a European, we've got state churches. You've got the Catholic Church in the south of Europe, but you've also got like state churches, the Swedish Lutheran State Church or the Anglican, like the English Church. And what was it that really made the American experiment? One, was it pro-Israel, like he's saying, like you alluded to some people close to George Washington. But secondly, I'm having a hard time reconciling it with like kind of the trad Catholic or the masculine neo-reformed they seem to be trying to make a state church again.
Yeah,
What
they are.
People
Yeah.
like Fuentes, for example, right? I mean, just to
Yeah.
put like a name to where people might have heard this rhetoric. When I hear, and I think this is what's disturbing to me, is that I hear people who are thinking they're real patriots when they're supporting some of the claims that people like him are saying, which I
Yeah.
think is, again, like John was saying, his experience and his knowledge is from the European state church and how that operates.
Sure.
And when I think of what these guys are saying, like Nick, I'm like, bro, you're literally saying to go back to and revert to what
Yeah.
American pilgrims
Yeah.
fled. So, yeah.
Totally. Well, and so there's a whole conversation around Catholicism and Protestantism that is really undergirds a lot of, there's a reason why America was a Protestant project. Like, let's put it that way. And I definitely do not claim to be an expert on the founders and all of that, but I in terms of how it touches this issue, I know that there were many voices that were next to Washington that were talking about them seeing the restoration of Israel actually being connected to the success of the American project. When it comes to these, and I want to make sure to not malign groups unfairly. So I want to talk about two specific groups. We can, because you guys brought this up. There is a splinter group, the SSPX, that is basically part of Catholicism, which I'm sure you guys to some degree know about, that denies the legitimacy of Vatican II. Now, Vatican II was maybe the most important theological statement by the Catholic Church on the Jewish people in the last 2,000 years. If you want to, it's not really 2,000, but whatever we want to give them, 1,600, 1,700 years. And so, I mean, it was a huge step forward. Some people say it doesn't go far enough. Some, like, we can have argument, we can have discussion around all of that. But what we can't say is that it was not an extremely productive step forward for the Catholic Church on its recognition of the Jewish people, and specifically a very small statement that says it acknowledges that the Jewish people find their election already in that of Abraham. Okay, now there's been there's been some really amazing documents that the Catholic Church has also put forward that really helps define what they mean by that. But basically, the splinter group, the SSPX, which Fuentes is absolutely a part of, and I think many people are that are not acknowledging it right now, basically see Vatican II as a heretical move by the Catholic Church, and so they are more or less, by what they're doing, like Protestants in a sense. Like, they are, they would never call themselves that, but they are protesting, which is what Protestantism is. They are protesting Vatican II. specifically because of the the decision that it made in that, and some of them will fall back on the Latin Mass changes that were made during that time. But for our conversation, that's why they're doing that. Now, I would say that this is a super fringe group. Okay, I don't want to malign all Catholics because many of my Catholic friends are super in support of Vatican II. And so SSPX is a splinter group from Vatican II, and so that is absolutely a stream that Fuentes has found himself in. Their whole goal, they want America to be a Catholic nation. Okay, they want to see a very strict form of their Catholic perspective being the. So it's not just an attack on Israel and the Jewish people; it's also an attack on Protestantism. This perspective, they believe that we are all heretics and schismatics, and this whole perspective. So that's out there lingering, and I find that it's very animating for recent converts into Catholicism. Again, people are looking for a foundation, they're looking for roots, and so when you have these very strong movements, to the uninitiated and the immature, these are very attractive things. Like, hey, I can go be a part of this thing
I
that has this.
admit, like, I would have sympathy for it as a Protestant,
Yeah,
because you said it's almost like an internal Catholic Protestantism. Because
yeah,
if I were Catholic, which I'm not, and I'm not an expert, but if I were Catholic, I would feel like, okay, we had Vatican II in the 1960s. It seemed to make a lot of kind of reforms, but the
mm-hmm,
Catholic Church is becoming kind of more and more liberal. We've had some really liberal popes of late,
mm-hmm.
that aren't supporting things that I would want to support. So I kind of feel like this issue where the Catholic Church and Vatican II made a great positive statement on the Jewish people, it's kind of like part of a package that's kind of a negative spin. If I
Yeah,
were a traditional Catholic, I would be really questioning that as somebody who wanted to
totally.
be committed.
Yeah, and I think unless you read, they did a 50-year reflection on Nostra Aetate in Vatican II, which has, I think, something like 45 points in it, where it clarifies, and it's actually a really, like, if I they deal with the theology of the Church Fathers and these other positions in way more detail, which I think is really clarifying in a good way. Like, they're not trying to just become this progressive thing, but it's exactly what you're saying. It seems like in the 60s and 70s, there was all this progressive stuff that took over the world. This is when Vatican II happened. We've seen a bunch of stuff like crumble since then. So let's go back to Vatican II and say that was the problem. So that's what's happening on the Catholic side. And I think that you could absolutely include guys like Steve Bannon, Joe Kent, Nick Fuentes, like certainly E. Michael
That priest
Jones,
was
who,
on Sean Ryan's show. I heard he was
yes,
affiliated with
yes.
what is it,
Um,
SSPX?
SSPX. This is for sure. I mean, dude, I see Candace Owens' husband, Farmer, George Farmer. We live near each other here in Tennessee. I see him with the SSPX guys. Like, I know that one of the things that might be going on with Candace is that as soon as she married George, like, she was now in this sphere of this kind of thinking. So that's happening on one side, but then on the reform side, you have basically the same version of this Christian nationalism. Is what, if you're seeing stuff about Christian nationalism, if you're seeing this thrown around, this America first, it's always Christ is king, not Jesus is Lord. It's always this very kind of crusadery, militant expression of it, and it has a spirit that it carries, like, it's undeniable. And so you see that same kind of thing, and a lot of that is connected to more of an ethno-nationalist perspective. You hear this kind of, it sounds innocent, but this term like heritage American, which is that, I am of the seed that kind of built this country. And look, I'm all for strong immigration policies and borders and all of this, like, is totally sane stuff. But there's something that's different that's happening in the reform stuff, and they're talking now about the need for a Christian prince. I don't know if you guys have seen that term, an American Christian prince, but you know it sometimes comes with a heavy dose of German nationalism. They're pulling this terminology from the same location, and they want a Christian nation that, to me, sounds a lot like Sharia, only with Christ. They want to bring back the ceremonial law and the Torah. It's a very, very interesting interesting is maybe the wrong word for it, but it's happening on both sides, and the crazy thing is that the SXPX group would kill the Reform guys, and the Reform guys would kill the Catholic guys and their version of of Christian nationalism. And I'm sitting here kind of watching this like, man, well, they both hate the Jews, and they both hate the Jews in Israel. So they have that in common, I guess. So, it's just it's an interesting time to be navigating all these questions. Let's put it that way.
I've noticed that neither of them, like both of them, have no place. They want like an American state church. Neither of them see a place for Jews in that equation, even though they don't like each other. And I haven't specialized in it, but as coming from Sweden, where there's been a Lutheran state church for a long time, and seeing Europe, and growing up some in my teen years in America, and studying theology, putting all that together, for me, it feels, in a church historical and just historical sense, deeply un-American.
Yeah, totally. But I think that where they're coming from is that because this corrosion has taken over the church, and there's probably a number of reasons why that's happened, the church has lost its ability to be salt and light in the culture. And now we're being overrun on all of these super important issues that take place in politics, that take place in, whether it's abortion, trans, all the stuff that we could talk about that we are all against. They're basically saying people are unfit to govern themselves. Like, we need a strong moral arm that will keep this other stuff in check. And their way of solving that problem is trying to institutionalize the church. And so there is, I think the question is like, how do you keep progressiveness in check, right? As a culture, how do you do that? That's what we're all saying. We might all actually agree that there's a problem, right? We're all looking at the same problem. How do we solve that problem? Do we institutionalize the church and like stone a gay person? Is that what we're saying? or did Jesus provide another method for dealing with this? And so that's really they're fearing that they are losing control of the American project. And so the response to that is to institutionalize morality, ultimately, is what we're saying. And so I think that is the question that's before America, is how are we going to rediscover like what made America great?
Yeah, 100%. So while we're on that topic, a few trends that I've seen from these groups, and I've actually encountered them personally at Amfest, this past Amfest in Arizona, which was just crazy. There was people everywhere and all kinds of groups and all kinds of, you name it, were there, kind of, each one holding up their flag of this is what I'm all about. And I just felt like there was a lot of positivity, but mixed in the crowd, you had these smaller groups, I would say, and these are the ones that you just mentioned, that to me, they looked weird. They were like trying to like peacock. And when I see that, as somebody who's in a special forces unit,
Right.
okay, you don't, anybody who peacocks, they're trying to defend something that isn't there. It's a false sense of security and false sense of confidence, and you're compensating for what you don't have. And so when I see that kind of behavior, that body language, I go, my radars go up, right? And I saw a lot of that.
Sure.
And then it leads to very, very dangerous rhetoric that leads to anti-Semitism, which then they disguise or protect themselves with, see, if I talk about the Jews, then everybody's going to cancel me. No, you're the one getting all the views. You're the one getting all the rating. I'm the guy, and you and others who are being shut down. Literally, we experienced it during post October 7, where all our accounts got shut down or censored, you name it. So I know firsthand what actual censorship feels like, and it's not what I'm seeing with these guys' numbers. Okay, we're claiming that, but some of the claims that they're making is, like, I saw this on Sean Ryan. He goes, the goyim, goys. Isn't that like a nasty term that the Jews are using as a racial slur against against Gentiles. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And the people he's asking the question, of course, they obviously don't know, because based on their answer, I'm like, okay, that was dead off. And then the other claim that they're making is like Tucker made this question with Mike Huckabee when he interviewed him at the airport, not in Israel, because he didn't want to take the time to actually enter the country. Total snob. And then later claimed that we roughed him up, which we had security footage from the airport. And this is the VIP lounge, by the way, just for people who are listening. And I know the VIP lounge very well because of my work in executive protection. And you get treated like a king there, by the way. And that's literally what you saw. You don't get any of the annoying questioning by the normal process you get, with the unwashed masses when we go through the airport.
Yeah, what I get when I go through. Yeah.
Yeah, like you get.
Yeah.
And I get too as an Israeli, by the
But
way.
he said the VIP lounge wasn't cleaned properly. They hadn't vacuumed in a while.
Oh, man.
Terrible.
Yeah.
But it's apparently good enough for all the other elites and millionaires and billionaires that I've done security for. But in any case, so in that lounge, he asks him this question about, why don't we just do a DNA test on the Jews? And it just became very, very reminiscent of Nazi kind of rhetoric, in my opinion, the way he was alluding to. And then part of that claim, in addition, is, oh, Israel doesn't allow DNA tests, which is total bunk as well. But in any case, I'm just piling up a few of these because it's a lot. But the other claim is that the prime minister of Israel isn't an actual Jew. He's a Khazar. He's he changed his name to Netanyahu when they came to Israel. Oh, and by the way, for people who don't know about Netanyahu's lineage, his father happens to be a Jewish historian, a famous historian. He's passed away now, but he was a famous Jewish historian. So apparently we allow famous, well-known Jewish historians who are not Jewish to tell our history and also to be our prime ministers. So this is just some of those crazy claims I'm seeing. The Goyim, they're not real Jews, Ashkenazi.
DNA.
What do you have to say about that?
Well, it always cracks me up when I hear Tucker say, these are the questions that you're not allowed to talk about. And I'm like, Tucker, for 90 days, you've been on a remorseless campaign of bringing the most, anti-Jewish, anti-Israel people onto your show. Like, what are you talking about? Like, this is all you talk about. What do you mean you can't talk about this? It's so backwards, but it's all part of the mirage, right? Like, it's all part of the this is what we can't do while I'm doing it. Don't look at this is what we're actually doing. It's this whole, it's like, the Wizard of Oz. You've got this thing behind the curtain. So it's totally insane. But going back to, I think if I could kind of distill your question, it's around the Khazars, which is, the Khazar theory. When I see people mention this, it's not the only thing that they mean, but it's predominantly what they mean. And for people that are not familiar with the Khazar theory, it was really popularized in the 1970s by a guy named Arthur Kessner. And he wrote a book called The 13th Tribe. And in this book, it was so funny about the reason he wrote this book was he was trying to stop anti-Semitism, but it just just magnified it. And so in his book, he basically points to something that the Jewish historians and even writes about in the around the 7th and 8th century. There was a conversion of a Khazar royal family. Okay, so we're probably talking about, I don't know, maybe 50 to 100 people that converted to Judaism around the area that we would know as modern day Turkey. Now, this theory postulates that all white Ashkenazi Jews are now, like, they're not real Jews, that they're Khazars, okay? But this gets like a lot of things wrong. First of all, the documentation that we have on this was not like a mass entire societal Turkish conversion to Judaism. It was just the royal family. The other aspect about this that this gets wrong is when you look at, for instance, like the language of the Ashkenazi is a combination of both German and Hebrew. So we're talking about Yiddish. Yiddish is predominantly a German and Hebrew language. Now, the working theory for what happened for the Jews in the diaspora after they were kicked out of the land of Israel, in around the 1st and 2nd century, was that they eventually migrated over to Germany around the Rhineland, and that hypothesis has always been known as the Rhineland, basically historical place where the Jews landed, and that makes a ton of sense because Yiddish is predominantly German. So you have this language, this new language that's formed, and it's a combination of German and Hebrew. There's no Turkish at all in Yiddish. So it makes no sense. Like, okay, you're telling me everyone from Turkey converted and there's not a single proof of that in the language, but we have all this German. So you have like all of these things that when you look at this, people just don't understand how to make sense of the fact that you could have black Jews, you could have white Jews, you could have brown Jews, you could have red Jews, you could have all these, because the claim of Jewishness has to do with parentage. It's not a racial claim. And that's why people don't understand this. So like being a descendant, a physical descendant of Abraham through Jacob is a claim on parentage. And then you have all of these, 12 tribes that go out and they marry in these different places. And so that's why you have this ability to have this broad, this broad spectrum of different looking people. It's not like Chinese where everyone, like, you can tell like they're Asian, for instance. You have this parentage claim that works very differently than race, but people don't understand that. And so the Khazar theory is very animating. You have this, and then you compare them through social media. You have the face of Bibi Netanyahu, which has basically become like a miniature version of Satan at this point for the masses. And you compare that to a brown looking Palestinian, and you're like, oh yeah, this is like a European guy. Like, this guy is a total colonizer. You have all of this perspective that plays into it. So the reality is that, like, no serious historian, even the Arab ones, like when you read their writings on the Khazar theory, they're all honest with this. They're like, there's no evidence for this. They even have something called the Levitical gene that you can see in Jewish DNA that shows that all of the Jewish people, even the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi, share the same common ancestor through the Levitical line because of the intermarriage rules that were required in that. And so you can see that, there is DNA evidence. There's all sorts of evidence of this, but it doesn't matter. Like, people are not interested in truth at this level. They're literally just trying to delegitimize Israel and the Jewish people. That's constantly what this is. This is what I kind of discovered at the end of writing this whole book, is how little evidence there is for any of these positions. It's pure, like, we're dealing with a spiritual dynamic. I thought there would be more to it going into this, but that's all it is. That's literally all it is.
I heard a Jewish rabbi say one time, it's funny how, like, all through history, up until the rebirth of Jewish independence, it was like, oh, we know who the Jews are. It's those people, and God cursed them. There they are. And then, like, boom, they regained their independence. And it's like, oh, these are not real Jews. Where did they come from?
We're totally, exactly. Well, and this is what Christian theology does too. We like the Jews as long as they're being cursed, but as soon as the moment, like, they start to receive any of that blessing or any of that element that distinguishes them from other people in any kind of positive way, those are not real Jews, and the Christian theology has its own version of that. And what's crazy about this, even if the Khazars did, even if there was, some kind of larger conversion into Judaism, by halakha law, they would be Jews. Like, they would still be Jews at that point. And so it's like, there's so many levels where this stuff breaks down, but again, it just does not matter, I don't think, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing that's important too, just to give some clarity on this, because I think I can talk about this as being one that grew up in Israel, and I think I know, and we all know our ancestry. I have people that I've met that know their ancestry to King David. I mean, it's like, what are you talking about? And so so just to give clarity for people out there are Israelis, there are Jews who have lived here since the time of Christ and before. Okay, so literally for centuries. So they can't just point towards their lineage, but actually also to generationally that they have been in the land of Israel predating the time of Jesus, which is incredible. for any people group in the world. Now, about the name for Netanyahu, and I think that's something that, again, people are just so ignorant about. Here's the irony, like John pointed out, when Jews were in the diaspora, it was all about locating those Jews and persecuting the Jews while we were in the diaspora. So what did Jews do? Jews did all kinds of tricks, everything we could, so to speak, to avoid persecution. Yeah. So either we stopped our Jewish practices and basically became Hellenized to the extreme, like you pointed out with Theodor Herzl, who was not a practicing Jew. So he's one of those examples of those who basically embraced the culture and everything to the point where he if you ask him to like read a prayer book, a Jewish prayer book, I don't know, but people like him, for example, maybe not him in specific, probably wouldn't even know how to read the Jewish prayer book in a synagogue if he was invited to join the service. So you have those who were very Hellenized, so to speak, and you have those who changed their names to sound less Hebrew. And the common thing that happened for Jews who came back from the diaspora, especially from Europe, who tried to cloak their Jewishness, they restored their and re-Hebraized their family names. So that's the only, that's the big, that's the big conspiracy that people are trying to make. Oh, wow, you're onto us. Yes, we re-Hebraized our names when we came back to the land of Israel. And it's not just
Totally.
Netanyahu. The first prime minister, Ben Gurion, he did the same, by the way. So I just gave you all another name for all you haters out there. Go ahead and tell me he's not a Jew, etc. It's just pure ignorance, and it's ridiculous.
Yeah,
It
for
blows my mind.
Herzl, we can
And
say,
Goyim, and the thing about the Goyim, again, there isn't
Oh,
such
yeah.
a thing as a religious slur. Jews are Goyim. Goyim means nations. So there's a Goy Gadol, or the set apart nation. That's Israel in the Bible. It's a biblical term, by the way. So if you have a
Right. It's
problem,
exactly.
take it up with God. Yeah. So Goyim is many times how Jews just, instead of saying Jewish people, they'll say Goyim, meaning the other people. In contrast to themselves, it's not a slur. It's literally saying nations. So you're offended by being called a nation, the nation of Switzerland, the nation of Zimbabwe, the nation of, I mean, fill in the blank,
I know.
the
I
nation
know.
of Israel. We're
Yeah.
also going. So that's the level of ignorance that these people fall down to. And it's just mind blowing. Like, what a brain rot with this anti Semitic hatred that it literally robs you of pure logic and
Yeah.
just straight thinking.
yeah,
I totally
I
agree.
I have a question for you, Chris. You mentioned how big of a role that a literal reading, not denying that there are deeper levels of scriptural interpretation, but just refusing to reject a literal reading of scripture makes such a big difference, which you
Yeah.
lay out in the book. Um, and I think that that's something that we see in some of the reform circles. They really refuse to give up a allegorical reading of the Old Testament sometimes. And the Catholics are really, some of the traditional Catholics are really embracing the kind of old allegorical interpretations of the church fathers to get rid of Israel. But for those who want a biblical argument, in your experience writing this book and talking with people, for your average Christian, I mean, everybody's different, but in your experience, for the average Christian, what is the or some of the most convincing biblical arguments for your thesis that God is a Zionist, or this
Yeah.
whole case for Israel?
Yeah. Well, I look at the incarnation of Jesus, the life of Jesus, as a very, very compelling piece of evidence for how we should literally read scripture and the prophetic texts. And when I say that, what I mean is that there's over 350 very, very specific ways that Jesus fulfilled the prophetic text, that if you were like pre-Jesus reading this, you might not totally be able to see, like, how is this going to come together when it says this and when it says this. And but when you look at it in hindsight, you're like, oh my gosh, like riding in on a donkey, being raised on the third day, like you have all these like super clear ways of like saying that's how we know Jesus did this. Okay, so if I look at that as a Christian, I'm going to apply that same level of reading now to what it says about Israel and the Jewish people. It makes no sense that I would allegorize that when the same way of looking at Jesus is right next to this, and now I can see that has literally happened. So I think that is, for me as a Christian, I think that's a very compelling way, is we have this incarnate God now, who fulfills all of these things to the T. It should not be surprising to us then that we would see the same level of restoration for the Jewish people in Israel when those promises are made right next to these things about Jesus. I can see you want to ask a question.
I was thinking, it reminds me of you when you were commenting on this idea, like Christians really want Jews to take Isaiah 53
yeah, right.
literally, but then you've got some other chapters close to Isaiah 53 about Israel and the restoration of Israel that seemingly people want to allegorize. So it's just more of that tendency. Okay, so if we establish that Jesus and the Gospels and the Gospel writers and take the prophetic text really seriously, they're not trying to allegorize everything. What are some passages that really establish that God is a Zionist?
Yeah. Well, so I think there's maybe another thing that I'll say before I answer that question. I think it's important for us to there has to be something about the Christian message that we see that does universalize at least this invitation to all mankind. I think that we have to believe that as Christians, right? We see um not just concern for the Jewish people, but now, wow, like there's this massive invitation to like the world to be a part of this spiritual kingdom. And I think that's where the reform guys and some of these guys are really good on. Like they do a really good job of articulating how this happens. The problem is we don't need to believe in just one or the other, right? Like God is a very big God. We can believe that he has initiated an invitation to all nations while also confirming the promises to the patriarchs. And so I think that some of the ways, I think Romans 9, 1 through 5 is breezed over very quickly sometimes, but I think that Paul's use of the present tense when he describes to them belong the covenants, the promises, even as he's talking about how the majority of them have rejected Jesus, he is distinguishing between the present tense reality that the covenants still belong to them, even in their present tense rejection, at least as the Christian understands this, even in their current rejection of Jesus, they are still present tense, the owner of the covenants. And so what are these covenants? Obviously we see, I talk about what those are, but for Paul, this would have been, like a non-question. I think that in Galatians, one of the Galatians is a very tricky book for many people. And you see a lot of dialogue on this book. And I think a lot of people miss kind of the main thrust of it. But one of the things that Paul says in there, he says basically what he says, I'm paraphrasing, is that if Abraham received this because of his works, the gift of basically cutting covenant with God, if he received this because of his works, then it was no longer a free gift received by grace. Like basically, and then he goes on to say that the Mosaic covenant, like, could not annul the Abrahamic covenant, because what a lot of Christianity wants to do is say that because the Jews failed in living out the Mosaic covenant, they have lost the basically the gift of land. But Paul totally shuts that down by saying, if it was based on their righteousness, it was never a gift in the first place, but Abraham received this through faith. And I think that's a very powerful way that Paul kind of refutes the loss of land through some kind of Mosaic breach. So those two things I think are very clear. I did a word study briefly in this book on the gifts and calling are irrevocable in Romans 11. But what's really important about your question is that word of gift inherently. If you do a deep dive into what first and second century means by the use of that word, there's been some really great scholarship on what that means. It always primarily meant the gift of land. Okay, so if you look at the context of how they were writing about the gifts and callings, what Paul meant by that predominantly, based on a deep dive of what that word meant in First and Second Temple Judaism, Second Temple Judaism, first and second century, was the gift of land. And so it's not so clear in the New Testament. It's not like you wouldn't certainly see like the expression of Zionism that you might see at your local church. But when you really dive into what some of these phrases and words mean, it's clear by by a number of different things. But I also think, if we're looking at continuity, what a lot of the reform circles and these other circles talk about, in my view, is completely would have never seemed continuous from what the kings, the prophets, the apostles believed just about their own nation. They try to interjects such a level of discontinuity in the two testaments that it's hard for me looking at what all the prophets and kings and judges and all these people said to try to disconnect the land from that creates, in my mind, an unthinkable expectation for the Jewish people. I just don't see how there's any continuity between that belief.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, if there's a hypothetical honest observer who's reading the prophets and what the kings of Israel were saying in the Bible, and then you get to kind of the reformed interpretation without the restoration of the land of Israel, like it's just such a different animal that you can't recognize.
Right.
Like God promised this, and what this interpretation says is being given is so different from the promise
Totally.
that it doesn't even connect.
That's exactly right. And I think that if we're to be honest, even the Jewish people who were followers of Jesus were surprised at the gospel going to the Gentiles meant, you see that in Peter's dream, like they kind of communicate like, who is this God, this amazing thing? We see that he has a heart for the Gentiles as well. So I think on both sides, there was some confusion about the plan of God. And I think that what the Reform guys really get right is the universal nature of the gospel. But that does not have to come at the expense of God keeping his promises, his material promises with the Jewish people. And so I argue for like a both and, I guess, not one or the other. I don't think they need to be pitted against each other.
That's a good
Totally.
point. I think one of the points that we can see from scripture, if you like, is when the apostle or the disciples, they approach Jesus, and these are literally like the last question they had. They had many questions, right? They'd kept bugging him about, what about this? What about that? Who will be seated at your right hand, etc. Right? Lots of debates about all kinds of different things. But if I remember correctly, the last recorded question they asked Jesus before he gets taken up is, will you at this time restore to us the kingdom of heaven? And
Of Israel, right? Doesn't he say
of
kingdom of Israel?
Israel, yeah,
Yes, it's, yes.
which is referring to the Messianic kingdom. In other words, it's a physical establishment of God's kingdom in the earth that we haven't seen yet, right? And then, of course, based on his answer, you also see that he's alluding to that's yet to come. And according to
Yeah.
what I saw in your book and the quotes that you brought from Jonathan Edwards and others, they're all claiming and they're all saying that they believe in a physical restoration of Israel to that physical particular land.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about that?
Well, I wish I would have given that as my answer when John asked me the question the first time. I just completely because that you're right. That's one of my favorite scriptures. And for people that don't, to kind of make sure we understand the context, this is given in Acts 1:6. Okay, so Jesus has resurrected. The apostles have just spent 40 days with Jesus. Okay, he's getting ready to ascend. And they ask Jesus, this is the last recorded question, is now the time that you'll return the kingdom of Israel? And so because this was the Messianic hope, this has been the hope that they have been wrestling and fighting over for thousands of years. That's in all the prophets and all the judges and it could be reduced to this one question. And what does Jesus say? He doesn't say, no, now the gospel is going to all the other nations. And this was always a spiritual thing. And you guys got it wrong for thinking it was a physical thing. He does in one sense talk about like, now is the time for the universal nature of the gospel to go out, but he gives them a timing. He responds in a timing manner, not saying that their expectation is wrong, but now is not the time that that's going to happen. And I think that, I think one of the debates within Judaism versus Christianity is the Messiah ben David versus the Messiah ben Yosef calling of the Messiah. And for people that are not familiar with those terms, people were expecting kind of the Davidic Messiah to come to rule and reign from Jerusalem. But the Messiah ben Yosef is this other concept of the suffering servant. And so first Jesus came as the suffering servant, on behalf of sins in the world, but one day he's going to return as Messiah ben David to rule from the throne of David in Jerusalem. And so that, to your point, has been talked about by many of the reformers. This is not, dispensationalism believes this, but many others outside of this believe in this concept. And so it is a powerful witness that this was the last recorded question from the disciples, that this was still on their heart. Is now the time that you're going to do this? So this idea that the resurrection solved this question somehow, or that it just pushed this question away, or that it terminated it in some way is totally crazy. The biblical witness does not bear that out.
Yeah.
It's piggybacking off of that. One question I thought would be really helpful for people, and this comes up on a lot of the podcasts that the regular people access, is this idea about the nature of Israel in the New Testament.
Yeah.
And one of the things is, when I first saw your book coming out, you've got a great website called presentwitness.org. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
I went there.
It's kind of like a side project. Yeah.
Yeah. But you have like a really accessible version in your book, but you also have more like deep dives on that website. And it had a section on who is the Israel of God in Galatians, for example.
Yeah.
Because you've got these three passages. I was wondering if you could respond to them in short. You've got the Israel of God in the end of Galatians. Is it the church of just multi-ethnic thing, or is it the Jewish people? Because doesn't Paul say in Romans that not Israel is Israel and not all Jews are real Jews?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what you'll hear on the podcast take.
Sure. Well, this question of Israel has been the hardest question for me to figure out. If I'm going to try to not be ideologically captured by either position on this, it has been the hardest, and I'll explain why. So let's first talk about like the three words or the three verses that you just brought up. And I'll kind of caveat all this by saying Israel is used something like 2,600 times in scripture. It's a very frequent word. And no one really argues about what it means except for these one or two places. So even Reformed scholarship or Catholic scholarship always acknowledges that Israel means national ethnic Israel. And the myriad, like the 2,500, 200, or 27 other times, it's just two places. Okay. So already from that understanding, I think it's really bad to build theological positions on one or two disputed verses. Okay. So if we're looking at how the Bible describes Israel, I think what we're saying is there ever a time when the word Israel is used to mean even the Gentile believing nations? And now I did a whole deep dive on the Israel of God in Galatians. My basic analysis on this is that Israel of God is not used in this manner to mean the church. I come to that through a Greek study, through the normal use of Israel, but also the belief that Paul, in this use of it here, has eschatological Israel in mind, like the what he sees as the future saved Israel. And if you're interested in this kind of stuff, you can go read that very, very long 15-page theological document, or get the book for the short version.
I did. It was great.
Yeah. I don't believe that verse is saying that's where I don't think that word means what you think it means. And so that's like my short answer to that. But then when we look at Romans 6:9, the Israel within Israel, and the inner dimension of a true Jew in Romans 2:28 and 29, I think you have to look at each one of those individually. Romans 2:28 and 29, I think it's best for Christians to start reading that at Romans 2:17, which is where I believe Paul starts his kind of theological argument in that section of scripture. And 2:17 through verse 2:24, whatever it is, he is saying, like, if you call yourself a light to the blind and you do this, if he's basically referencing Isaiah, where Israel has this specific call. And so to me, it's really clear his focus in this section of scripture is he's talking about like Jews only. But what I think he's trying to do is make the case to Gentiles that you don't have to become Jewish to be saved, because the inner dimension of a true Jew is someone that recognizes the Messiah. Now, from the Christian perspective, this is like the case I believe that he's making. This would be offensive to, non-Christian Jews maybe, but to understand Paul's argumentation here, I think we have to understand that he's only got Jewish people in view, saying that even when it comes to Jews, being Jewish doesn't save you. The inner dimension of a true Jew is someone who X, Y, and Z. And so that's the case that I think he's making in Romans 2:28. I think he's narrowing the definition through the lens of salvation, not through the lens of covenantal connection, not through the lens of land, not through the lens of these other things. I think just through the lens of salvation, he's saying that the inner dimension of a true Jew is one who recognizes Jesus. And that's not meant to be applied to Gentiles. And you see that right in Romans 3, he picks back up. So what benefit is it to be a Jew? And then he says much in every way, right? He goes through. So I think you have to understand his whole logic, which starts from 2:17 through through chapter 3:2, basically. So that's how I would deal.
Tell me if I'm understanding this right. Then it would be like saying, for me as a Swede, not every Swede is a real Swede at heart. Mm-hmm. But I'm not saying that Germans are all of a sudden Swedes now with that expression.
I think is he contracting the definition or is he expanding it? Right. That's essentially what we're saying. In my view, through his argumentation around salvation, Paul is contracting that definition, and not expanding it to the Gentiles. Okay. Now,
would you say the same thing is happening when it says not all of Israel is Israel?
I think it could be, but I actually think that the best argumentation that I've heard on this is that Paul is actually launching into describing the historical nature of Israel with Abraham. So not everyone knows this, but Abraham had 8 descendants, right? But only one was the son of the promise, which was Isaac. Isaac was the son of the problem, even though he had Ishmael, even though Ishmael was circumcised first. And what we never read about is Abraham's 6 other descendants. Only one was the son of the promise. So right after Paul says this in Romans 6 and 9, he describes Abraham's specific, literal, by flesh heirs. And so I think that he could be saying that even though Abraham had 8 descendants, only the son of the promise was, and I think because he's talking about election in all of this. And so we apply this interpretation to Christianity and Judaism, but I actually think that maybe what Paul's doing here is I think he's giving a history lesson on the election of God through the Jewish people. So by saying that even though Abraham had 8 descendants who technically could have been Israel, it was only the son of the promise, Isaac, then through Jacob, who is Israel. And so you can that's how I argue it in the book. He could be doing what I just argued in Romans 2:28 and 29, but I think it's probably more likely that he is distinguishing between Abraham's descendants because he's making the election argument about about natural Israel.
So if we sum that up, we've got that may be, but I mean, like, God could have given us a super simple book to just read all the answers, or he could make us work for it a little bit sometimes.
Yeah.
But we've got some 2,700 something places in the Bible, Old and New Testament, that say Israel. Mm-hmm. And we've got maybe 2 places where it's disputed if it has to do with the church or not. And I thought you brought a surprising number of heavy-hitting Christian theological voices who say, look, where this is an uphill battle. If you really stick to that the church is Israel, you're actually just you're really theologically committed.
Totally. And so here's the counter. Totally. And that's what I really believe. I don't believe that if you look at the biblical text, you can see the church being Israel through any type of description of words or verse. My counter argument to that, though, is both the example of, for instance, the olive tree or Ruth, where you go, where your God will be my God. Where is this thing where we as Gentiles who are Christians come in under the God of Israel, and we are considered part of the nation because of that, right? We see this as a historical reality through the story of Ruth. When Paul describes the olive tree in Romans 9, it's not or Romans 11, there's not 2 olive trees, right? We are grafted in among the natural branches. So I think that there is, in some sense, I think that we have to come alongside the mission of Israel, and to some degree. What I take the most issue is when people try to use these verses to cut out the Jewish people. That's where my big problem is. My big problem is not, in some sense, seeing that like there's only one people of God, and we are somehow merged into this thing, even though I think that Scripture doesn't quite say it like that. So I really struggle with it because of those ideas, you know.
So we should embrace the universal redemption of all mankind without cutting out the elect Israel
Yeah, I
in the center of God's plan as
right.
his conduit for doing this great work.
It would be like being adopted into a family and then trying to disparage the natural son, you know? Like it's a crazy perspective to have. But at the same time, wouldn't you want that adopted son to feel like he's part of that family? Like isn't there a sense of this where we are all trying to worship and serve the God of Israel? So we have to find some place that like unifies this work in some way. So that's why I struggle with this tension, and I would not take nearly as hard of a like as a of a hard stance that the church and Israel are totally two separate things, like the way dispensationalism does, because I'm really trying to fight through the olive tree example, the idea of Ruth, the idea of adoption, these concepts that I think are super beautiful and biblical concepts. But I feel like the church has been irresponsible with them. And I think that they've done what Paul has told us not to do. I think our sin has not been seeing us adopted into the family of Israel. It's been trying to cut out the natural children that has been our sin. And I think that we wouldn't be having this discussion around this if we had done a better job of honoring what Paul says, and you know his extreme defense of the Jewish people in Romans 9-11.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
In fact, that I make that argument, I think, multiple times when I travel, speak in churches,
Mm-hmm.
and warn the Gentile church, right? To use that word goy. Here he goes, those
Mm-hmm.
Jews using that goy word. But seriously, I mean, like, to look at, like you pointed out, I mean, Paul was so strong about they are the olive tree. You and the nations are grafted into these
Mm-hmm.
wild olive shoots are grafted into the tree, and the tree supports you, not vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. I mean, I think that's been the big sin of the church
Mm-hmm.
globally, is wanting to replace the natural family. And that's another example I actually use, an analogy, because I think it's on point, is that would you expect, as someone who's adopted, to just come and like change the rules and
Mm-hmm.
mess everything and turn everything on its head and be like, no, 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 this is my family and this is how things are going to be done from now on? I mean,
Right.
how crazy would
It
that
is
be?
wild. Yeah.
Yeah. But that's what the nations have done in so many cases, by
Mm-hmm.
wanting to replace Israel, take Israel's place. And I laugh and I say, do you understand that, first of all, and here's the irony, is that the Jewish people, many of us are sick of the claim that we're chosen. Many of
Mm-hmm.
us will tell you,
Yeah.
please take my place. I don't
So do
want
I.
it. We don't
Right. Right.
want it,
Yes.
because of the
Exactly.
weight and of what has come historically for centuries of persecution and hatred towards that election.
Mm.
And it's like, and I think that's part of the problem too, is that the Gentiles have never experienced that level of hatred and I would say, what's the word, jealousy from the nations. Like, it's
Mm.
like the nations, I get the feeling it's like you're
Mm.
jealous of us somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, what is there to be jealous of? Number
Right.
one, we're one of the smallest people groups on the planet. Yet this claim that we control everything and take everything,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, we wish, how many of us joke, Israelis, like, we wish that we had so much power that you guys claim we have.
Right. I know. I know. It's an unserious position, to be totally honest with you. It has not. There's a really great Jewish theologian that I bring up a couple times in that book called Michael Wieskograd, who was a conversation with the Protestant reformer theologian Karl Barth. And, he has this great thing where he says, being chosen has meant that we have had to live under a standard that's so impossible that no group of people could possibly succeed under it. And when we fail, we have such judgment delivered upon us that no nation's back could withstand it. Like, that's what it means to be chosen, is like, you have this blessing and curses, which, by the way, we're not one-to-one. I'm talking about Deuteronomy 28 and 29. When you succeed, this is what will happen, and when you don't, this is what will happen. And the curses outnumber the blessings like 7-1. And so that's what it means to be chosen, is to have the long, painful history of the Jewish people. And I know I look at it today right now. I end this book with basically saying, like, are you willing to suffer with the Jewish people? Like, are you willing to suffer? Like, you want to love the Jewish people, which is the bare minimum as a Christian you should do. Like, if you are willing to love the people, what that means, love the Jewish people, what that means right now is, are you willing to suffer with them? Are you willing to be called a rat, Zionist, goy, Jew loving, whatever it is, all the things that I get called, any number. I have an article that's going out in Christian Post today, where I basically say, I make the case that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism, and I know I'm going to get dragged for it. Like, I know that just based on the climate that we are in, are you willing to suffer with the Jewish people the way that they're suffered because of where they are in the world right now? That's my real question to Christians. Like, you want to love the Jewish people? It probably doesn't require America giving foreign aid to Israel. God is going to preserve the Jewish people and the Jewish nation, but it does require you to love them. And for you to love them, you will be hated for that simple decision if you choose to make if you choose to stand with the Jewish people. And so it's really not complicated, but we make it very complicated.
Well, Chris, what I love so much when what you have done is it really feels like God has brought you along. Obviously, this has taken a lot of your life to bring you to this point of releasing this book, your theological studies and what God did in your life before that to really bring you to this point. But I'm so grateful to see you as an answer to prayer or a need in the church, in the culture right now, because right now we have needed a book like this that's able to tackle stuff all the way from the parting of the ways, church history, deep theology in an accessible way, and then bring it to all the podcast debates and what you're going to see and the geopolitical debates of what you're going to see in a way that's like actually defensible. In the end, you get to, are you willing to get on God's side and suffer? But
right. Yeah.
I'm so grateful that a tool like this has appeared. And it's obviously, I'm grateful for you, but I'm grateful for God doing this work in your life to bring a tool like this right now. Because there are, when did this book release? Like this month, maybe?
Yeah. It was out officially two weeks ago, maybe 10 days ago. And what's crazy, dude, is that it already popped up on 4 Amazon bestseller lists in multiple categories. And so, yeah, I think that the climate is, and I could have never known this, dude. I didn't write this book because I wanted to be anything or I want to be anything. I wrote it because it was just like on my heart. I couldn't escape the book, but I do think that we are in this like very critical hour for America around this conversation. And, I just think we have to be willing to take a stand right now, which does not mean, I say this all the time, we don't have to love everything Bibi does. We don't have to rah every rocket Israel sends. I don't actually know those things well enough to even be able to talk about that intelligently. But my perspective on spiritual Zionism is that God is somehow in control of the major storyline at work right now, and that's what I encourage people to get behind.
Yeah, 100%. One of the things I wanted to ask you, I know this isn't your field of expertise, so or maybe we'll see. This is more like John and mine expertise. But I'll tie it in also into a larger statement. I'll kind of combine a few of these questions if you like. So people are saying right now, like the big thing is like AIPAC, is controlling America. You have, the protocols of the elders of Zion. baked into that, claim. And then the fear, and what I'm noticing, it's like a ripple effect. It's like Israel does something good, like they're trying to liberate the Iranian people from this regime that is, I mean, every, I've spoken to real Iranians. Okay, so I know what they're going through. Contrary to a lot of these so-called experts that are like, no, 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 you don't understand. I'm like, no, I do understand, because I spoke to the actual Iranians who are actually living through that persecution. Some of which have even fled. I have one of them actually on the podcast as well. A wonderful story to listen to. But it's like these crazy claims, it's like they're literally not even willing to stand up for these poor people. Israel's doing it. And then Joe Kent steps away, makes this big hubbub, but it all boils down to, but because see, Israel's controlling us. Israel's pulling us into this. It's all Israel's fault. And then the next like wave I've seen with Tucker, with this fear mongering, look, the IDF have these patches, and those patches of the temple and the
Oh my gosh.
Messiah.
Yeah.
And what about the third temple? Oh, wait, maybe one of those Iranian rockets, Israel's going to, they're going to blow up the Al-Aqsa, which, by the way, is actually the Dome of the Rock, morons. We're not talking about the Al-Aqsa. You'll talk about the Al-Aqsa. It's actually the Dome of the Rock. That's where the temple needs to stand. By the way, huge difference between the two. One's a shrine, one's a mosque. Anyways, semantics.
Yeah.
To the ignorant. And it's totally. Like, that's how I know. But it's also how I know they're talking total trash.
Nonsense.
And they have no clue what they're talking about.
Right.
Because it's like, you don't even know. So what do you have to say about that loaded question?
Oh, brother? My gosh, bro. It's like 15 questions. Well, so,
because I think it's interrelated. You know what I mean? It's like this.
Sure.
It's like this domino.
It is a domino for sure. I'm just trying to structure it in my mind how I want to respond, so I don't ramble here. I saw a video of Trump when 40 years ago. It was in 1987, so not quite 40 years, 39 years ago, where he was talking about if he was president, he would go in and roll Iran. He's talking about what a problem Iran is. This is 40 years ago. This is him talking in like in New York. He's as a citizen just talking about how much he hates Iran. Okay. Someone straight up asked Trump, like, did you go into Iran or did Israel convince you to go into Iran because of Iran? And Trump's like, no, I had to convince Bibi to go into Iran. So you can have all of this data, right? You can have all of this, like, it flies in the face of what everyone says, but they're going to still believe that AIPAC is wagging Trump in some way. It just does not, it doesn't track with reality. I mean, I really try to take this stuff seriously. I try to look at it like, okay, what are you seeing that, like, why do you believe this? And there's just nothing there. Like, there really is nothing behind all this. So that's the Iran thing. I totally understand why Americans are worried about a quagmire. Like, there's legitimate conversation to have around, like, what should America's influence in the middle? I've got many of my friends were special forces military guys. Like, I get it. Like, I totally understand, like, a lot of the trepidation that they feel. I think that it's hard for me to understand how, after what we just did in Venezuela, what threat Trump is threatening to do in Cuba, how he has said all this connects to his vision of Iran. It's hard for me to see how you can see all of that and think that AIPAC is behind this somehow. I just do not understand where that comes from. Maybe it will end up being the wrong decision.
Way, just to give people some context, we're talking about a few $100 million. That's not, right. It doesn't even scratch the surface.
It's nothing.
Of other foreign entities and lobbies who put in billions of dollars.
Yeah.
It
doesn't even end up on the top. The top what number of lobbying efforts in DC? It's a. I mean, what's the place?
It's like, I think the lobbying is like 4.7 trillion or something. It's some
rank. There's like dozens and dozens higher.
It's not even close. But then, they start talking about the shadow government besides the thing that we can't see. And it's like, it doesn't, of course, because if you can't prove it, then there's some conspiracy behind it for why you can't prove it. And so you have this, you can't ever get them to stick to like a certain line of truth to evaluate. So I think, I don't know. I understand why people are concerned about Iran, but I think that the idea that it's somehow Israel's fault is just totally insane. I don't think that tracks with reality at all. when it comes to Tucker and Joe Kent and these guys, I don't know if you guys saw this, but I was amazed I was in Peru when this interview came out. And so I saw, like, within an hour of it releasing, that it already had something like some 60,000 likes on Instagram or something. And I was like, man, that's crazy. Tucker's stuff usually gets like a fourth of that, a third of that after it's been out for 2 or 3 days. And then I was looking at this data analytics company that was showing that this had been totally astroturfed by accounts in Pakistan and these other places. And you're like, man, this stuff isn't even real. We're all just being played here. This thing is bigger than we think it is. So I think that that's one of the things that's going on too. In regards to the Temple Mount, as I said this before we got started here, I was specifically not trying to do certain things with my book. I was not trying to wade into end time stuff. I was not trying to use dispensational scholarship, and I was not trying to talk about the Temple Mount, not because they're not all super important and valid things, but as I said, I feel like you can only open up so many fronts when you're at war. And my decision to not go into that front was very strategic, because I just didn't want, because this is such a controversial topic, like you guys said, it was just something that I felt was, it deserves like its own book or its own thing if you're going to take on an issue like that, at least in my views. And so I wouldn't say that I'm super dialed into the day-to-day of what's happening on the Temple Mount. I am not going to be surprised at all. I can say when, but I'll just say if this comes back to Jewish control. I do think it's just a matter of time, but I also think that that's God's timing on that and how that needs to happen. I would be curious to hear from you guys how you think that will happen. Like, another thing that I would be curious to talk about is just what you think the best solution is for the Palestinian issue right now. Like, not the Israeli Arabs inside of Israel, but West Bank and Gaza. Like, what do you feel like is the best solution for that? I'd be interested to have a conversation around that. I know it's not inherently a talking point, but
Yeah. No, that's a great question. But what I will do is I'll first talk about the Iran thing to give people context. So I'm actually on the forefront of the post October 7th war with my reserve unit. We're literally on the very front lines of all the different fronts, 5 deployments, 4 to Gaza, 1 to Lebanon. We've been fighting a multi-front war. And for people just to give people some context, we are stretched to the very limits of our resources, of our manpower, of our willpower, to eliminate in succinct all these threats. And what we've done and what our generals have done is they've tried to kind of hone all of our efforts threat by threat by threat by threat, while creating a protective layer, if you like, of defense at the same time. So it's a very, very difficult place to be in. Opening a front in Iran, literally, like you said, is actually a huge sacrifice for Israel, because what that means is my air capabilities for the ground troops right now is going to be extremely limited. For example, now in Lebanon, where our troops have been trying to do some clearing out of of Hezbollah reestablishing themselves and trying to create a mess again up there. So by us doing those missions, we're actually endangering our soldiers, because we cannot prioritize any air assets to them in those ground operations, which creates a very complex maneuverability for our troops, right? So why would you do this? It's insanity. Why the now? Like you said, because as far as Trump is concerned, this threat has reached its peak. And there's multiple, but I think there's a big chessboard and a small chessboard. The big one is China, world dominance, who's going to be the superpower. And when you see the chess pieces being moved, we saw that with Maduro in the special op mission in Venezuela. So that's a chess piece move that gives America's dominance over the flow of oil and so on, which China has been a beneficiary of that. Iran is next in line as far as benefiting the Chinese with oil capabilities and so on and so forth.
Absolutely.
So that right there is the big picture, and I think a lot of people are missing that. They're really missing that, and they're over obsessed with this Israel syndrome, an obsession that Israel's pulling all these things. So I agree with you. I don't think at all. I mean, it's the worst time possible for us right now, in my opinion, to
Yeah.
be bogged down in Iran.
And I think
I,
for us too, because for the sake of just finally getting out of the Middle East,
Yeah.
and there can be ample debate about was that right or wrong, and that's why I'm saying, like, we'll see how successful all this is. But I think that what I feel very confident of is that this is not because of Israel that we made this decision.
And so it's
I
just
will.
important to me to, again, we're not going to get into a deep dive into Iran here, but it plays into what you're talking about is the way people's view and how they blow up Israel and make Israel into the problem for everything. It's like, no, if you have your brain screwed on straight, so to speak, because of biblical grounding, biblical foundation, biblical roots, which are connected with your American roots of the original founding fathers, then I think you're not going to get swayed into all these conspiracies. And I think that's, again, just to make clarity for everybody, that's what we're talking about here and the why.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could
Um,
say a couple of words about when it comes to the Palestinians and and also about the Temple Mount. I think you're right that the Temple Mount deserves its entire own topic because it's such a heavy thing in Christian theology, in Jewish theology, and in modern politics. So I'm just now working on trying to finish publishing a 300-page book on Jesus on the Temple Mount.
Wow.
So I think it's best to just leave that discussion aside. But if we talk about the Palestinian question with people, now engaging with Israel and is God a Zionist, I think that we're going to have to start approaching that issue as a Christian gospel engagement with Muslims. So really the root of the conflict in this land, directly, a large part of it is broader than an Arab-Israeli conflict. It's broader than a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And it's broader than Arab-Israeli in the sense that it embraces Persians and Turks. But what do they have in common is Islam. Because just like you said, Christianity built this huge system on that the Jews would never gain sovereignty and return and restore independence. So Islam has an even more extreme form of that kind of theology. And so it is fundamentally, they don't mind Jews being dhimmis. They don't mind Christian being oppressed dhimmis in their society. But their fundamental worldview is built on that Jews will never regain sovereignty in Muslim territory, which is here. So I think the solution a lot more is basically a gospel solution. We need to reach out. I see a lot of good work with apologists like I think his name is David Wood, is it, who does Muslim apologetics? We need to be a little bit more. I think the danger is, let me put it this way, when it comes to the Palestinian issue, is that Christians start feeling kind of this suicidal compassion, suicidal empathy of going too far. Yes, we need that compassion, but it needs to be more with a truth side to it that actually confronts Islam.
Yeah.
Because that is at the root of it. And we're going to have to walk a tough line of having compassion for people, but without compromising on truth.
Yeah. I agree. What's so difficult for me about the Palestinian question right now is because if I were to defend any working model of the best future for the Palestinians, it's the ones who are Israeli Arabs. It's the 2 million Israeli Arabs who have full rights and citizenship. That's the only time I've seen this work. What happens when these Palestinians go to the West? Well, they destroy the West. They bring all the ideology, they bring all the social justice stuff, they bring all of this bleeding heart to London, to New York, to all these places, right? What happens when they are in the surrounding Arab nations? Predominantly outside of Jordan, they've been put in, what amount to more or less concentration camps. I mean, they have been accepted to some degree in Egypt and Jordan, but I mean, when we were looking at Lebanon and Syria, that was not a good situation either. The Palestinian territories have been a disaster, but Israel, it can't absorb the rest of these Palestinians into Israel, even if it would make a temporary better situation because of the demographic challenges that they have. So I'm like, how do you transform these places I agree with you. I think that ultimately the solution is the gospel, but how does that practically work? Like, how do we do that work?
For one thing, I think the worldwide church needs to take on Gaza. Like
Yeah.
we need to, and I think there's a surprising number of Israeli Jews who would be sympathetic to that.
Yeah.
But any way that the church can get into Gaza with a message that doesn't compromise Israel, but even like a supersessionist Christian is one less like jihadi. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, totally. No, it's true. It's totally true. I mean, it is there's at least some counterbalance of that occurs in that. Um, yeah, I just think about it all. It was one of the most difficult parts that I wrote about in the book because I don't feel like I don't know what to do about that. Like, I think that realistically, what might happen is that I think that Israel is justified when through a defensive war they take land from the Palestinians. Like I think that's historically justifiable. I think that's justifiable through war doctrine. I think that there's all sorts of cases that you can make for like when you are antagonized over and over and over, eventually you lose the marbles. You can't play anymore, but I think that unfortunately it would create such a media problem for Israel. I just can't. I don't know. Is it really ultimately going to be worth that?
Yeah, it's a
I
great
don't know.
question. In fact, Denise
Yeah.
D'Souza made that point a few months ago at the Combating Anti-Semitism conference here in
Mhm.
Jerusalem that I heard him speak at, and he gave 3 points that are the 3 main reasons that legitimize statehood for peoples, for any
Mhm.
country, for any nation. And
Mhm.
he said Israel it meets all of those and exceeds them.
Mhm.
And one of those points is that through war,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And that's every country in the world.
Right.
And it's only Israel that's not allowed to win a war and gain
Mhm.
land or territory and expand itself as post of as the
Mhm.
victor of any war that we fought against our enemies, right?
Yeah.
But everyone else is allowed to do that, including America, including Switzerland, including any country you can think
Mhm.
of in the world. None of them were created out
Totally.
of just
Yeah.
fair,
Oh, yeah.
peace treaty. Hey,
We
you don't mind me taking this slice of land from you, bro? Is
right.
that okay?
Totally.
Hey, Germany, you okay with that? Hey,
Yeah.
France, you all right? And they're all like, yeah, let's just talk
Yeah.
about it. No country in the world,
Yeah.
I know. I
And
know.
John,
There is
you're
a
from Sweden.
difference.
Like think about the Swedish wars that I've read about. It's like they got
Yeah.
really bloody, you
Yeah.
know?
The right of conquest. I mean, that's one of them, and Israel does win the wars, but it does go deeper. Legally speaking, with San Remo and the League of Nations, the
Mhm.
strongest national claim it doesn't disinherit people's civil rights, but the strongest national claim to the territories between the river and the sea, including Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, is firmly on the side of Israel. You can look up international lawyers like
Yeah.
Eugene Kontorovich and a whole slew of others.
Yeah.
So you've got that, so there's the legal claim, there's the historic
Mhm.
claim, and then you also have the right of conquest. Israel exceeds, on all of those.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I think we're going to see things move in Judea and Samaria,
Mhm.
hopefully, soon and in our lifetimes. But God does allow these Muslim Arab minorities to be here, and He does allow them to be a thorn in Israel's national side. Like I heard a
Mhm.
guy in Tel Aviv tell me once, I think we would have abandoned our identity as Jews a long time ago if it wasn't for the Palestinians.
So interesting. Yeah, that's so interesting. It is interesting how God uses all that together for his purposes somehow. Um,
Yeah.
I yeah, I wrote about this group that was led by the sheik. I forget his name, but he rules over 700,000 Palestinians in the West Bank. And he came to Israel and he said, "Hey, like, I'm not, I'm not the Palestinian Authority here, but we would come together and join the Abraham Accords if you would allow us to." And I thought that was so interesting that he was trying to speak for because I think that the Palestinians are so tired of the PLO and the PA and Hamas and Fatah and all these just groups that mean absolutely nothing, and the Western American does not understand that. They just want to go to work and to be at school and to raise families like normal people. And I think that they're tired of the politics. Now, this is not every Palestinian, obviously, but there is a group of them that I think would recognize Israel's sovereignty. And I doubt that the Palestinian leadership will ever give them any real authority. And I think that the two lightning rods in the future for Israel will be the Temple Mount and, the Judea and Samaria. And I think that that's where all of this is going to kind of fall in the future in terms of just, the
interesting how the Bible says that too.
I know. It is it's funny. I think the dispensationalists will be much, much more right than people want to give them credit for.
How dare you?
How dare you? I know.
Well, I agree with you, by the way, about the Palestinians, because not just because it's my opinion, but I've literally heard it from their mouths. All the Palestinians I've ever had conversations with, if they're Muslim, if they're Christian, they're all sick and tired of these terror group leaders who they claim are all corrupt. But they also, at the same time, because of how they're brainwashed to be anti-Israel, they say also your leadership is corrupt. And so it's like they're kind of like against this, like in their minds, leaderships, both on the Israeli side and their side, are all corrupt. They're all bad. They all have bad intent. But if you boil it down to, well, what do you want? They all say the same thing. We just want peace. We want our own sliver of land and quiet. And I think that's the majority of people just around the world, right? It's not exclusive to them. And so that's what I try to help people in the West try to understand too, is when you kind of boil it down to, like, well, Israel's the aggressor and Israel the colonial and Israel this, and you polarize these ideas that you have with these crazy ideas that are just not true versus reality on the ground. You speak to the normal person, the normal Israeli. We don't hate Arabs. We're not anti-Arabs. We don't wish them bad. And I think for many of the Palestinians, it's more or less the same when you speak to the normal person on the street.
That's been my experience too. And I spent a lot of time in the West Bank, and I for the most part did not find that militant perspective, and I think unfortunately those are never the people that get the microphone. So
exactly. So just to change topics now, and we'll wrap this up, but one of the points I wanted to draw out here, because I saw it in your book and I was like, oh, that's bang on, like rarely is this talked about. And this issue about Jerusalem syndrome, right? And it kind of ties into my question about the Temple Mount, because it wasn't for you to give us a expert answer on that. But it's what I've noticed throughout this war is what Tucker all of a sudden is interested in the Temple Mount, right? Sean Ryan, he asked this priest, well, what about the third temple? I'm like, these guys all of a sudden are asking questions that only like John and I and a few other nerds geek out on, that per our expert experience on the ground. And now it's like mainstream conversation. And I think it's part of that is there's the Jerusalem syndrome, like you talk about in your book, and I want you to explain that to the audience here, and that thing. But I think it's also a global Israel derangement syndrome is like the extension of that.
Totally.
And I think that's what I find to be ironic.
Yeah, I'm with you 1,000%. So Jerusalem syndrome is an actual like psychosis. Like it's got its own like medical definition. It's got its own Wikipedia definition. And it happens to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Like it's not just a Christian thing. It's
and we also have special wards actually in our hospitals for that.
Yes,
by the way.
Right. And which is wild. And it's when you go to Jerusalem and the spiritual climate is so intense that you start to like basically think that you're John the Baptist or you're Jesus the Messiah or you're some prophetic figure in the future who's come to bring peace to Jerusalem. It's basically like a religious psychosis that happens where you lose your mind because of the energy of Jerusalem. And I make this case essentially in my article that's coming out today. It's a very similar case about the same idea that the attention, even if you hate Israel, even if you don't want America to fund, the small amount of money when you look at our US GDP that we send to Israel, it does not warrant the level of attention that it gets. I mean, our foreign aid to all nations is less than 0.5% of our GDP, to all nations, not just Israel. Okay. You might have strong opinions about that. You might be right. Okay. You might have all these perspectives on what this should look like. Does that warrant Tucker talking for 90 days on one of the biggest shows in America about just the Jewish people in Israel? Like that it doesn't make sense. I know what he's saying is that he just hates the foreign aid. You could pick with that platform.
That reminds me, by the way, sorry to cut you off on that, but you know that compilation where somebody did, where he talks about Israel, like I forget how many times, but it's like hundreds of times. And they tell you in such a short span, and you're like, oh my gosh,
Right. No, but all I'm saying, I don't care about Israel. It's just a small state with no oil, like totally. But this is what I mean is like, this is the meta story, is that the Bible said that Jerusalem would be a cup of reeling towards the end days. And I think that regardless of how we see everything in the world, I think one of the things that's an indicator of an intensifying of the spiritual situation is deception. Okay. As we see deception growing, like that's an indicator of something. And so whether it's a person who has Jerusalem syndrome in the streets, or it's Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens or anyone else who's drinking from this cup of reeling and just spewing out deception, like that is just the reality, like for where we are at. And I think this is another point I make in the book, is that the spiritual climate around Jerusalem and Israel and the Jewish people is so intense that it is going to force you to take a position. Like you cannot walk through this like just thinking that you cannot choose to see one way or the other what's happening in the world right now around this issue. It makes no sense outside of a spiritual lens.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, I have a really good scripture to caveat on that. But first, I'm going to ask you guys well, maybe not John, but where is this found in Scripture? Okay, where it talks about these end time deceptions that we find ourselves in. It says a period of extreme confusion and false hope before the final redemption. And it hints to a time when truth will be scarce and people will follow false leaders.
That's really good.
Yeah. and or the pre-Messianic war will often, and this also commentary, will be often interpreted not only as a physical conflict, but also a period of profound spiritual confusion where a lie will be prevalent in the world.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that to me, it's like international Jerusalem syndrome around the planet. And it's causing people to go totally insane. And, it just makes no sense.
Here's another one. a time where the pseudo-Messiah or evil figure will appear and mislead many, causing a great, powerful deception.
Mm. I'm just going to call it. Are we in Matthew 24 here? Is that where we're at?
So all of those quotes, by the way, those are from the Talmud, the horrible Talmud.
Really? Those are all wow. That's so funny because
Talmudic. Yes, these are Talmudic passages and dissertation by rabbinic rabbis giving commentary on the end days. And actually, I'll give you all now a direct quote from the Talmud, and it's called the footsteps, or the footsteps of Messiah, the era of the Messiah. According to the Talmud, Sota 49b, in the time leading up to the Messiah, truth will be absent or hidden, and young men will insult the old. This era is described as one where falsehood prevails, often interpreted as a form of divine testing, similar to the strong delusion. So that's a Talmudic quote directly from the Talmud.
Interesting.
And then now I'm going to read to you from 2 Thessalonians 2, where it says, and this is starting verse 9. The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan, with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing, because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. Therefore, God sends them a strong delusion so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness.
That's good.
I think Chris's book will be a great medicine for a natural home remedy, all natural from Scripture, to take to avoid catching international Jerusalem syndrome.
Yeah, it's so funny because I do feel like the only thing that I feel like is inoculated against the spirit that's taking over culture right now is Christians that have a biblical worldview on this issue. Like, it's the only thing. Like, I will say that James Lindsay, the agnostic, has a very sobering and accurate perspective of Israel, and I thought that was really interesting. I don't see that a lot, but I would not bet that perspective is going to catch on generally among agnostics, because I think that this is a spiritual disease. It's like a virus that's flowing through the world, and so unless you have a spiritual inoculation against that, you're gonna catch it. And so I think it's just going to continue to grow, unfortunately, because I wouldn't say that most people have a spiritually informed perspective that matches well with reality, and you need that in the days that we're in right now.
Yeah.
God
And I
willing, it
think
will
it's
help some people
important.
recover.
Yeah.
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 And I think it's important that people understand in the West how much we have in common with the Jewish people. I mean, you
Yeah.
guys just heard those quotes. John, you said Matthew. Chris, I don't know what went through your mind, which parts of the Bible, right? But I kind
Right.
of set y'all up. And it's important for people to understand, right? Is that when you don't actually know what the Jewish people believe, just like a lot of the Jewish people don't actually know what the Christian world believe. We have preconceived ideas of the other. And I've experienced that firsthand living here in Israel and having Judeo-Christian relations and trying to build bridges. And that's why I wanted to bring that up, because listen, we all have the same understanding about the end times, that if it's the Messiah's coming first or second coming, irregardless, the times leading up to these final days is going to be that of great deception, great lies going out there, and people falling for them. And it's important that we guard ourselves. In my personal opinion, we guard ourselves with God's word, that we're grounded in reading God's word, not just reading, but prayerfully. You prayerfully read through God's word and let God speak to you through what it says, and give you that strong foundation. Because in my opinion, without that, I would be lost. And I think a lot of other people would be lost.
Absolutely.
Without that. And I think you guys probably can say the same to that.
Absolutely.
100%.
John, you want to close us off here with any final questions, buddy?
Well, my final question would be, where in the world can people get your book? Are we also going to get an audio version of
Yes.
this? I
Yeah.
could have used that at times driving this week.
Oh man, I know. So everyone was like, I guess the new thing is to let AI read your audiobook. And everyone was like, you should let AI read your audiobook. And it sounds really good. And I was like, dude, I cannot do that. I cannot. The problem is then I had to read it. And, it took me forever. And this is my first time reading an audiobook, but we were at the tail end of, producing that should be out on Amazon in less than 2 weeks. You can currently go to Amazon and get it on Kindle and a physical copy. The book is God a Zionist? Finding God's Story in a World Obsessed with Israel. So I would just recommend going to Amazon, and you can get, if you're not in the States, you can get the ebook, or wait for the audiobook, which will be out in a couple weeks. So Amazon, the monolithic company eating us all, is where you can get it.
Is there any place online that people can follow you, connect with you, and that kind of thing?
Yeah, you can go to presentwitness.org, where I do a lot of writing. If you like deeper theological takes on things, that's where a lot of that deeper theology is. And we have a show called The One New Man, with a guy named John Myers, who was it started one of the first Messianic synagogues back in the 70s, and now lives here in the States. And he's Jewish, but he connects with a lot of Orthodox and Rabbinic Jews as well as Christians, and we dialogue about a lot of that stuff. So
Very cool. Yeah, we'll
yeah.
definitely have all of those links in the description below. So for those of you watching this interview, make sure to always check the description part of this interview, because I always have links to the guests where you guys can follow up with them. And I recommend, of course, every one of our guests to definitely follow, like, subscribe, all that good stuff.
Mhm.
But I think for you, especially for the Christian audience that is listening, and many of them have been bombarding me with questions in a lot of these issues that we brought up today. And so I really hope that this has been valuable information for you. But make sure to share it, because if you don't share this episode with your
Mhm.
friends and so on, then they're not going to get empowered with a lot of these truths that we brought forward here. And I think, Chris, you did an incredible job, brother, just really highlighting all of these main issues that has been distorted through mainstream
Mhm.
media, distorted by these talking heads, these what I call
Mhm.
armchair experts.
Yeah, yeah.
And and for me, who's been studying these things for many years, just reading through not all your book, but just portions of it, because I'm a very slow reader. But just the little that I've gone through, it is
Mhm.
just a powerhouse. I mean, it's so
Yeah.
good.
I
It's
appreciate
really so
that.
good,
I've really
you
tried to
know?
make it just, it was really designed for a cultural moment. If there's a question being asked right now on the internet, there's a good chance I answer it in the book. And I really try to do it and with the understanding that, most people can't read tons of academic scholarship. And I just, like I want just your normal everyday Christian who loves his family and goes to work to be able to think about this stuff in a way that is accessible for them. And I found too that it's really helpful for Gen Z. So, I have a lot of parents and grandparents that are like, what can I give my kid? I see him engaging, because the reality is that if you're not actively engaging with your children on this issue, then the internet is, um, let's just say, propagandizing them right now, or they are catechizing them, they're shaping them in this anti-Israel narrative because it's everywhere. So, this book has worked really well for parents and grandparents that are in that position as well.
And also
Yeah.
for spiritual fathers, I'm telling you, if you're a pastor or if you
Mhm.
have a pastor, give it to them, because the internet is catechizing
Yeah.
all the people in the pews the other 6 days of the week.
Yeah.
And he's going to
It's
need it,
true.
because this has got to be addressed from the pews. And
Mhm.
everyone who buys this book, whether on Kindle or physically online, one of the biggest things, you don't know how big a thing it is, but leave a review. Because I'm telling
Yeah.
you, this book is a gem, and we need to get it out there to lots and lots of people. And leaving real reviews on Amazon makes a huge difference. So, guys,
Yeah.
please get on that.
Yeah. Well, guys, it's been so great to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, man. I really appreciate the deep dive that we got to do.
Mhm.
And again, guys, if you've watched up till now, thank you for listening, guys. Make sure to help support us, support what Chris is doing, what John is doing.
Mhm.
And again, make sure to amplify this message, get out as many people as possible. Chris, John, brothers, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been awesome. Shalom.
Shalom.